Come to the conclusion of our studies in Old Testament introduction this evening. Just in time because my folder's just about to wear out. I've had the same one ever since the sermon. See, that's what it looks like in the back, where you carry it there. It's worn all the way through. But I imagine I can afford a new one of those, though. We come to the end, Old Testament studies, as far as Old Testament introduction is concerned. I trust you've been keeping up all along. Generally, people make a panic race towards the finish line. At least this is the way it always is in studies in school. Whenever they find out that the end is just about upon them, it's time to panic and try to get as much as you can. And I believe this is about the 60-something message now, so it's a little too late to get everything right now. Should have been here ever since a year ago from this spring, and you would have had time to get everything that's been said, because we've covered a lot. We've given you a lot of memory text. I won't embarrass you by asking you how many of you have actually memorized all of those. We're not going to grade you on it, but we said at the very beginning there were a few requirements, and that happened to be one of them, of attending the class, is memorizing the text. It'll be to your own detriment if you didn't memorize them. And I could even be a little more serious than that. I wouldn't want to be before the judgment throne if I just sat in here the whole year and a half that we've been here and just played around and never done what we asked you to do. Same is true with reading your Old Testament through. I think we said go through it several times. Have you done that? Yeah. Praise God. Got all the texts memorized? Evidently not. Anyone got all of them memorized? Every single one of them? Well, I do. No reason why most of you shouldn't have them. Just 39 books, just a little over 39 verses. I believe about 2 or 3 of them maybe had a couple of verses along with the text. That's only 39. That's nothing in comparison to, I think, Numbers chapter 7. That's 89 verses just in one chapter. That's nothing in comparison to that. 39 short verses, all you had to do to memorize. Now, the same will be true with New Testament. So, I don't know where that'll leave you. I know where it leaves me, though, because I've done my homework. I've done what I'm supposed to do. We're going to go back quickly to Nehemiah, because I don't think I gave you a purpose for Nehemiah before we get into Chronicles that will finish out our studies here. I think one of the other requirements was to obtain some of the outside material and read it. We gave you a list of books that you could obtain and do some independent study on your own. It'll always enhance the things that we give you here so you can find out what's wrong and what's right, and who's teaching the things that are wrong and who's teaching the things that are right. You'll never know if you just stay reading comic books or the newspaper. There's more important things to be reading than that. Purpose of Nehemiah is to give a history of the post-exilic fortification of the city of Jerusalem. And pretty much the whole book is wrapped up in this idea and this thought of giving us a history of the post-exilic fortification of the city. Now, this is the last time that we see Jerusalem, the city, in the Old Testament, is in the book of Nehemiah. Although Nehemiah really comes right in the middle of the Old Testament, as far as its orderly arrangement, this is the last time we see the city as far as the Old Testament is concerned. We don't see it again until we open the New Testament all the way over to the Gospel of Luke is the next time in the Scriptures that we see the city of Jerusalem. In Luke chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. Now that spans many centuries, spans a rather large section in your Bible. Between the last time we see the city in the Old Testament and the next time we see it in the Bible, the first in the New Testament, Luke 2:21. And it's interesting, of course, that the next time that we see it, or the first time that we see it in the New Testament, has to do with the Messiah, the one that the whole Old Testament had been portraying in various types and symbols and ways and prophecies. When 8 days were accomplished for the circumcising of the child, his name was called Jesus, which was so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days of her purification, according to the law of Moses, were accomplished, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Now, of course, the city, by implication, is given to us back in chapter 1 of Luke, because there you've got John Baptist's father, Zechariah, going into the temple. So, of course, that's got to be in Jerusalem, but it's not mentioned there. The first time is over in Luke 2. And the whole time, of course, the Scriptures have been silent concerning the city, simply because there have been no Scriptures during that period. Between Nehemiah, he's just about the end, and he goes all the way down to the time of Malachi. They're right around the same time, so he's just about the end. And Luke starts off there with the birth of Christ, 8 days after that, which would be the very beginning of the New Testament. All right, so that's the purpose for Nehemiah. Now we come to the last two books that we'll study, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They're the last books in the Old Testament. We'll look first of all at the name of the book. The Hebrew Bible, both of the books are combined together to form one rather large single volume known as the Words of the Days, taken from 1 Chronicles 27:24, if you'll look there. And here we see that what he means by that is not just words as far as spoken words, but the records or the annals of the days. 1 Chronicles 27:24. Now this is speaking, of course, of another one of those many varied sources that the author of Chronicles employed in writing his history from Adam to the end of the Babylonian captivity, but it mentions another group of chronicles, and this is what the word means over here. You see, Chronicles doesn't start off saying this is Chronicles. The first word in the book is Adam, and then it goes from there, and you're certainly not going to name the book Adam. If there'd be any book to name Adam, it'd be Genesis. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, began to number, but he finished not, because there fell wrath for it against Israel, neither was the number put in the account of the Chronicles of King David. There's one of the places where we happen to see that word Chronicles. And so the Hebrews called 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which in effect were one book, the Words of the Days. The LXX is responsible for dividing Chronicles up into the two books that we have. And the LXX gave it a wrong name by calling Chronicles the things omitted. And we'll discuss later on here this evening what they meant by that. But they called Chronicles the things omitted. Where did we get our name, Chronicles? We got that from Jerome, the Latin Vulgate edition of the Bible. He said that the name of the book might be called a chronicle of the entire divine history. Thus, the word chronicle passed over from the Latin finally into the various translations, eventually into English, and we call it Chronicles. But what does Chronicles tell you? Again, it's one of those names like Ecclesiastes. Then you've got to have a name for the name of the book, because Chronicles doesn't tell you anything. Ecclesiastes doesn't tell you anything. Now, the preacher tells you something. At least you know what a preacher is, but you don't know what an Ecclesiastes is. And the same is true with a lot of these. And the same is true with Chronicles. Chronicles, what does Chronicles mean? Chronicles of what? Well, go back to chapter 1 and you see it's a chronicle of just about everything that has happened since Ezra's day, because you go back to the very first word in the book and it's Adam. Now that's back as early as Genesis 1. So by Chronicles he means a record or the annals of the days. Which days? All the days of history, from the beginning of creation, from Genesis 1 up until the time of the author. Which brings us to the authorship. Traditionally, Ezra has been named as the best possible solution for the absence of any mentioning in the books as far as the author is concerned, and there are several reasons for this. And it again, like some of the Jeremianic traditions, happens to be a fairly old one as well as reliable one. Ezra fits the bill for several reasons. In the first place, we've got language in 1st and 2nd Chronicles that is definitely post-exilic, so it has to put it after the exile. In other words, it couldn't have been written by Jeremiah. The language is post-exilic. When you study the original in these things, and you'll just see little words that weren't used before the exile or during the exile that just happened to have been picked up. Just like in any culture, we have words that are used today that weren't used in the 1800s. And so in the year 2200, if someone's reading back in some literature during the 1980s, they can look for the words. Now, is it 1880s or 1980s? Well, watch and see what they write and how they write it. And you could have a good indication of when the book was written. In the second place, we have post-exilic details in the book. A good example of that is in chapter 3 with the genealogy verses 19 through 21, which is the genealogy of Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel was an exilic figure, but if it gives a genealogy that goes down through at least 2 generations, then that puts the book post-exilic then, because Zerubbabel is living during the exile, and he actually is one of those who brings back the first group of the exiles, which brings him over himself into the post-exilic period. And then if the author also, at the same time, is able not only to give us Zerubbabel's name, which means the author would have to be post-exilic, but in addition to that, give us 2 generations away from Zerubbabel, his son and his grandson, well, that would push it a good 40 or 50 years away from the time of Zerubbabel, which would, of course, put it well within the confines of the early post-exilic period. And then finally, there's a very unique connection between 2 Chronicles 36, verses 22 and 23, and the first 3 verses of the book of Ezra. And that's just like an author, if he's written a book perhaps a little bit earlier than whenever the book of Ezra is being written, and he concluded it with a reference to the famous proclamation that Cyrus gave so that the exiles could return, that when in the future he takes up the subject of writing another book, he picks up right with the ending, with the identical ending, more or less to show himself to be the author of both of the books, tying himself in with the book that came before. And so that's exactly what he does. First, 2 or 3 verses here of Ezra 1 follow just in line with what had already been said in 2 Chronicles. So, in other words, that gives Ezra, you think of Ezra as being the author of the book of Ezra, but he's written 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, and Ezra, which gives him a rather long amount of material that he's authored. Same is true with Jeremiah. Writing 1st and 2nd Kings and the book of Jeremiah and Lamentations, it's a lot of writing. Not just did Moses write many things, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, but you've got several other Old Testament authors that also wrote more books than the average Christian might realize if he's just going by the name of the book. Well, Ezra wrote Ezra, Jeremiah wrote Jeremiah, and Samuel wrote Samuel. But what about Chronicles and Kings? Chronicles couldn't have written Chronicles, nor Kings Kings. So we have to locate another author. So tradition holds that Ezra, and I don't think that there's any problem with that at all. All right, the date of the book, if it's written by Ezra, then obviously it had to be during his time period. As I said, Chronicles is the last book in the Old Testament as far as its order is concerned. We'll show you this from a passage in another message at another time, but it can be proven from the New Testament that Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew Bible. The date of the book is somewhere towards the latter half of the 5th century B.C. Somewhere around or between 450 to 425 BC. Now, of course, it appears that Ezra would have written Chronicles before the book that we call Ezra, but how much before, there's no way of knowing. We know that Ezra's time is around 458, and he's not going to start writing until sometime after that. I mean, he's busy with the chores that he has in trying to keep the people on track spiritually, and that's out of the law of Moses. I mean, he doesn't need to be writing his own books. He can't even get them to obey the 5 they already have. So it's going to be a later time before he sits down and begins to set in writing 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra. But evidently, Chronicles would have had to have come before Ezra, yet Chronicles still is placed at the very end of the Old Testament. Now, Nehemiah and Malachi could well have been written later than Chronicles. Just because Chronicles is the last book in order doesn't mean necessarily that it has to have been the last book that was written chronologically. Which helps solve some things because Nehemiah and Malachi lived later on than Ezra does. So maybe their books were written later. If so, it makes no difference because whenever they would have written, it would have had to have been during the time period of Ezra, because Ezra traditionally has been the one who gathered together all of the various books of the Old Testament, gathering them together in one grouping so that we have a Genesis all the way through a Chronicles. Ezra is the one who did that. So that means that Malachi and Nehemiah would have had to have been written before Ezra had died. And we really don't know how long he lived. He passes off the scene in Nehemiah's book, and perhaps he could be dead during some of the later time period and something could have been added, but he could well have lived a little bit longer, long enough in any way to gather together Malachi, Nehemiah, get the whole Old Testament together. So you see, we owe it, in other words, to Ezra for having all of these books gathered together. Evidently, Ezra, remember he's called in his book in Nehemiah as the ready scribe in the law of Moses. Even though Jerusalem, the temple, and all of its precincts were burned by the Babylonians in the captivity of 586, there would have been, of course, Old Testament books and documents that would have been preserved. The priest, at the forfeiture of their own life, would have made sure the righteous holy ones, that is, would have, at the forfeiture of their own life, made certain that some of these books, at least a few copies of each of these books, would have remained all the way through that period of the burning and the sacking of the city, as well as the period of the exile, which means that somehow we've got to get all of these manuscripts now, perhaps with Ezra himself, since he's plainly called a ready scribe in the law of Moses, back from Babylonian captivity, back to Jerusalem, so that they can start teaching the people out of the law of Moses. Remember over in Nehemiah's book, it says that he actually stands up and reads out of the book. So he's got it right there with him. Now remember, not a book like we think of a book, but a scroll. So he's got it right there with him. Now there are a lot of false traditions about what happened to the various things whenever the city fell. We'll study some of those later. There's one tradition that Jeremiah went in the temple and got the Ark of the Covenant and hid it in one of the caves near Jerusalem so that the Babylonians wouldn't take it. And there's a lot of fanciful notions on what happened to the golden lampstands and the table of shewbread and all this that they had there and all of the various sacred Mosaic instruments. Now, a lot of things had been added, you see. There were a lot of duplications of things. You don't only just have, no longer just have one lampstand there. You've got 10 lampstands now, and you've got a multiplication of many of the other items. What happened to all of them? Well, one tradition is Jeremiah, and I was reading an article in a magazine on archaeology not too long ago, that someone had thought that they had found the cave where the Ark of the Covenant was. They actually, I believe, dug into the cave and found out that the people that were supposed to be knowledgeable about geology and rock formation thought that there was an opening that was man-made there, but it was some type of natural opening there, and there really wasn't anything behind it besides just an empty space and then more solid rock. But it's very interesting, the work that takes place over there in Palestine, Because remember, Dead Sea Scrolls stayed hidden there for 2,000 years. 1947, accidentally discovered. And although Palestine is practically nothing as far as any territory is concerned, just 100 by 50 miles, you've got so many desert areas, so many caves and wadis and little hiding places that you could have a lot of things there. Hidden, that is. Now, I'm not suggesting that I believe that theory that Jeremiah really did hide the Ark of the Covenant, because we'll trace the origin of that and find out its validity at some later time. But it is true that these manuscripts would had to have been preserved, because, again, another one of the traditions is that you'll find in the Apocrypha that the manuscripts were destroyed and God anointed and inspired Ezra to sit down and rewrite the whole Old Testament. So he sat down and wrote all of what Moses had written and so forth, with the same degree of inspiration that Moses and Jeremiah and all the prophets who had come before had. That's not true. We have to assume that someone, if that was you, if someone was burning your house, I don't know what you'd grab, but it would be the Bible as far as I'm concerned. You might want to grab grandmother's old clock there or something that had been passed down, but you get the Bible and then you get faith from the Bible and you can get all the clocks you need in the future. But the clock won't help you get any more Bibles, though. They'll just help you tell time and keep you attached to the traditions of your forefathers. Natural ones rather than the spiritual ones of the Bible. So that's the first thing I'd grab. It only makes sense. That's the first thing the priest would get. Forget about gold and lampstands and so forth. Get the Pentateuch. Get the prophets. Grab the manuscripts. And at whatever cost, make sure they're preserved. And, in fact, they were. So the date puts it 450, 425. Okay, a purpose for the book of Ezra is to give a history of the chosen elect line, L-I-N-E, from creation to the end of the Babylonian captivity from a priestly point of view. Now, that last thing is the important one. You want to underline it. From a priestly point of view. Now, this makes Chronicles the longest book in the Old Testament as far as its coverage of history is concerned. Because unlike some of the other books that go maybe for several centuries, you see Genesis even goes for several thousand years. The book of Genesis, in its material that it has, covers several thousand years in history. But it can only go down until the time of Joseph, when he dies, when he's 110 years old in chapter 50 of Genesis. And it starts with Adam, and it goes to Joseph. But look at Chronicles. Chronicles starts with Adam, but it goes to the end of the Babylonian captivity, which makes it cover thousands and thousands of years in Old Testament history, which makes it the longest. Which would be the longest in the New Testament, as far as coverage of history is concerned? Luke. What does Luke have in his book? Chapter 3, you've got the genealogy, Seth, who was the son of Adam, who was the son of God. He goes all the way back to the very beginning, all the way back to Genesis 1. But he doesn't stop with Babylonian captivity. He comes all the way down until the ascension of Christ, chapter 24 of Luke's book. So it would, of course, cover even more material than Chronicles covers. Covers everything from Adam all the way until the ascension of Christ. And these facts make these two books unique. The Old Testament book of Chronicles, New Testament of Luke. Begin with Adam and give us a rather detailed history. Now we want next of all to take a look at the relationship between Chronicles and Kings and Samuel. Now we said earlier that when the LXX divided the book into two portions, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it gave the name Things Omitted. And what it meant by that was that Chronicles was a supplement to Samuel and Kings by providing that material which had been omitted from Samuel and Kings. And that's where they got the name Things Omitted. Otherwise, why give Chronicles when you're covering the same time period as Samuel and Kings? unless you're going to give not a duplicate, but a supplement to what had been provided in Samuel and Kings, and therefore bring everyone up to date with perhaps some items of history that they had not known before. But the problem with that is Chronicles covers just a whole lot of things that were covered by Samuel and Kings, which means it couldn't just be a book of things omitted, because the very things we find in Chronicles also are found back in Samuel and Kings. So in other words, it couldn't be a book of things omitted. Then the other extreme that people go to is that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are a duplication of Samuel and Kings. And that is why if they read 1st and 2nd Samuel and perhaps on a good day get through 1st and 2nd Kings, they'll skip Chronicles because they think Chronicles is a duplication of Samuel and Kings. And nothing could be further from the truth for the following reasons. First of all, remember in our purpose of Chronicles, Chronicles is a book written from a priestly point of view. Samuel was written by a prophet, and Kings was written by a prophet, which means that the material, although some of it might be the same between Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, nevertheless, the material that's been provided in Samuel and Kings is written from a prophetic standpoint, whereas that which is contained in Chronicles is written from a priestly standpoint. That is why you have so much detail as far as genealogies are concerned in Chronicles, especially your genealogies of priests, your genealogies of those tribes of Israel which had remained faithful to the Davidic throne, the Davidic promise, the Davidic covenant, because the priests aren't too concerned. You see, they are the righteous, holy, Hasidim, separated ones of the Old Testament at this time period anyway. And they're not too interested in a lot of rebellious tribes and rebellious people. They're only interested in those things that would speak of some type of priestly background. This is why you find so much material in liturgy in 1st and 2nd Chronicles concerning temple service, concerning the temple itself. The temple appears time and time and time again in Chronicles, more than it does back in Samuel and Kings, because it's being written from someone who thinks like a priest, because he is a priest. And he doesn't think like a prophet. Remember, Samuel and Kings is written so many times from a judgmental standpoint. This is why you'll find in the book that, like in Kings, that such and such king has done like Jeroboam did. He followed after the sons of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Always reminding you this is why God's punishing them, because of their sins. And that's the way a prophet would think. Because a prophet not only is a predictor of future events, but he's a preacher of righteousness. And if he finds someone living in unrighteousness, then he's going to be sure to mention that. But you see David's case with Bathsheba, guess what? That's not found in Chronicles. That's interesting to a prophet, because you've got sin, but that doesn't interest someone who's concerned about priestly functions. Furthermore, in Chronicles, you have much information concerning music and worship, concerning the instruments of Levitical worship. You've got much there in 1st Chronicles concerning David inventing some of those musical instruments, because, again, this is what would come to the mind of a priest who's writing the book. If you go back over to 1st Chronicles, for example. Now, in the purpose, remember I said that it's to give a history of the elect line, and that has to start all the way back with Adam, because it's going to begin to work its way down. Adam, then is it going to be Cain, Abel, or Seth? Well, he picks the right one, Seth. Then he goes down through Noah. Is it going to be Shem, Ham, or Japheth? Well, Shem is the chosen line, so it's going to come through Shem. And at every division there, you've got him following along that right line that will finally bring, of course, King David on the scene, which will ultimately bring the Messiah on the scene. And that's why you've got all of these details in the genealogies found here in the beginning of 1st Chronicles. But if you look back in, chapter 9, for example. Verse 33. These are the singers. I said this is what you find here, some of the references to the Levitical worship. These are the singers, chief of the fathers of the Levites, who, remaining in the chambers, were free, for they were employed in that work day and night. And you see, that's just one verse, but you have to trace that all the way back through, well, back through verse 2 of chapter 9, and you see that he's giving, again, a rather detailed genealogy because it concerns things that would concern a priestly office, which, again, is another one of those things that points us to the fact it wasn't written by one of the famous Old Testament prophets like most of the books were, one of our great oral prophets or one of our great literary prophets, but it's written from a priestly standpoint by a priest and by a scribe. Okay, another reason why we see it's not simply a duplication of Samuel and Kings is because in Chronicles there is a total exclusion of any reference to the northern kingdom of Israel. That doesn't interest a priest. He's only interested in the chosen, separated righteous ones, those in the line of King David.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the...
Whenever they've got some question concerning an Old Testament king, and this probably happened long. Now, if it's a king, it's got to be somewhere in either Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. But there's a good way to keep it separated. If you want to write this down, I'll just give it to you as it comes to me. It's separated, and you'll know which of those books to go to if you're looking for a certain thing. In 1 Samuel, the book only deals with Samuel, Saul, and David. Looking for Solomon, then don't go to 1 Samuel. You won't even find him there. The first half of the book deals with the prophet Samuel. Then the next quarter of the book deals with King Saul. And although Saul continues all the way to the end, to chapter 31, David comes to the forefront from then on out as being the one who we know from the anointings that he's received who's going to be the next king of Judah, or he ends up king of Judah, but king of Israel, you've got one combined kingdom at the time. So you've got just three persons concerned there. 2 Samuel, from beginning to end, concerns King David. So if you're looking for David, then 2 Samuel is a good guess. Now when we come to Kings, David's not even covered, but in the very beginning of Kings, so don't look in Kings to find David. In 1 Kings, around the first, I believe, 11 chapters, you have Solomon in the forefront. And then from around 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 17, you've got kings of Judah and kings of Israel during that period. Now that's a very small portion of all of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles where you can go to find kings of Israel. You won't find them in Chronicles. Chronicles only deals with kings of Judah. So if you're looking for a king of Israel, it's going to be in 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 17. And then, of course, on to the end of 2 Kings, which I think is 25, you've picked up with the end of the kingdom of Judah. So you'll deal more with the kings of Judah. Now, Chronicles, you might want to just put a pause there in your notes, and whenever I give you an outline, then I'll show you what Chronicles covers. But what we're saying right now is that Chronicles does not cover the northern kingdom because a priest wouldn't be interested in that. So if you're looking for a king in Israel, go back to the second half of 1 Kings and the first half of 2 Kings. That's where you find him. If you're looking for David, don't go to Kings. If you're looking for David as a king, don't go to 1 Samuel. He's not king there. He doesn't become king till 2 Samuel or here in 1 Chronicles. So that will help you keep it divided in your mind on where these kings will be found. Otherwise, you remember that story about, David and what King James calls the mulberry. It really wasn't the mulberry, but the mulberry trees. Well, it's either in Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. But which one? And you just spend your time looking, page after page, looking at the heading of the page, looking for, mulberry trees there. And you'll go all the way through Kings, and you won't find it there because David's not in Kings. So you can just skip over that, and since he's not king in 1 Samuel, you can skip over that. And since he doesn't come into the picture in 2 Chronicles, you can skip over that. That only leaves you 1 Chronicles and 2 Samuel. The quicker you get that in your mind, the better you'll be able to locate those kings of Israel. Because that is one of the most confusing periods in Old Testament history. Most people know about Moses, Exodus, and so forth, but when you get to those kings, it gets very confusing. So it helps if you've got it broken down and you know where to go when you're looking for something. All right, then a third reason we're talking about why Chronicles is not just a duplication. First of all, I said it's written from a priestly point of view rather than prophetic. Secondly, it excludes the northern kingdom. And then thirdly, a reason why it's not just a duplication is because there are many internal differences in Chronicles in comparison to Samuel and Kings. One good example of that you're all familiar with is 2 Chronicles 20 and Jehoshaphat's victory of praise. Now that's not found anywhere else but in 2 Chronicles 20. So how can you say it's a duplication? In order to have a duplication, you've got to have something that's already come before that. And that's not found anywhere else in the Old Testament. It's only found in 2 Chronicles 20. Another internal difference, a very important one, probably the most important one, is the total lack of any reference to Elijah and Elisha. Remember, they occupy all of the second half of 1 Kings and all of the second half of 1 Kings, all of the first half of 2 Kings. Because Elijah comes on the scene in 1 Kings 17:1. And Elisha extends on through about 2 Kings 13. And they are very important. But what are they? They're prophets. And they are very important in the establishment of prophetism in Israel. Because remember, they're doing most of their ministering in the northern kingdom, and their purpose, basically, is to combat the Baalism that had been introduced by Jezebel into the kingdom. Now, that's not too important to a priest, because he's mainly concerned about those things that would concern the priestly cult in Israel, rather than the prophetic guild. And so, therefore, if you want to find out about Elijah and Elisha, that'll only be in 1 and 2 Kings. That won't be in Chronicles. So, we see that Chronicles is not just things omitted, neither is it a duplication of things, but it is a separate book written from another point of view, some material which had been seen earlier, a lot of material which had not been seen earlier. And so, therefore, you can't read Samuel and Kings and then skip Chronicles because you think Chronicles is just going to tell me what I already know. Chronicles is a different book. And you'd be amazed whenever you read through Chronicles, even though it's giving the same story or incident which you had seen earlier in Samuel or Kings, there will be different material provided, and you'll generally find some reference about the temple or the priest or something like that, because of the author of the book. And therefore you have to put both of the accounts together. This is the same thing that's true with the Gospels. Just because you know the story of the centurion in Matthew 8 doesn't mean you know the story of the centurion over in Luke's Gospel, because it's a little bit different in Luke's Gospel. In one place it appears like in Matthew 8, that the centurion is actually coming to Jesus. Remember there where he comes to Jesus and beseeches him to come first of all and just speak the word and his slave will be healed. But Luke says the centurion never left his home. He sent a messenger to Jesus. And so you got to read both of those accounts or you'll end up with only half of the story. Now, of course, both of those can't be true. He couldn't have gone but then not gone and sent a messenger. That's why you have to read both of them. You put it together. Generally, it's just like people who have a bad eye, those that do have a bad eye, or a bad leg, they'll favor that good eye or favor that good leg. And the same is true, I find, most of the time with people in their, just take the Gospels, for example, in their understanding of the Gospels. If there's a particular story, generally they only know it from one Gospel's point of view. The centurion is a good example. See, practically all of you, we've taught about the centurion from Matthew 8. And you think of Matthew 8 and the centurion, that's the account. And most people, just like favoring a bad leg, favor whatever account it is that they know, and they'll favor that one in Matthew. And Matthew's is just entirely different than the one over there in Luke. Same is true with the crucifixion. There's, in all four Gospels, the accounts aren't the same. In one Gospel it says he's crucified the 3rd hour of the day. In another Gospel he's crucified the 6th hour of the day. Well, it can't be both of them. As far as when he was put on the cross. It can't be both of them. It can only be one of them. And you remember that superscription that was put over him on the cross? Some of them says, this is the Son of God. Some of them says, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God. Well, which one was it? This was he that said that he was King of the Jews, or whatever. 4 different Gospels, 4 different people writing them. Just like whenever you've got 3 people that witness an accident, you know, a car wreck at the intersection, the police ask number 1, what happened? He says, well, I saw the car skidding as he came to the intersection there, and the other car hadn't pulled out yet, but there was a rabbit that had crossed the road. Another one says, no, the other car had already pulled out, because, see, he was looking at the second car. He didn't see the first car skidding to avoid the rabbit, and all he saw was that the second car had pulled out. And the third fellow says, no, it wasn't like that at all. It was the second car that pulled out, and he was the one that was skidding for the rabbit, because he put on his brakes whenever he saw the first one putting on his brakes. Now, a good policeman is going to try to put all those stories together, because you don't have any reason to tell a lie about it. I mean, if you're just a passerby and you saw an accident there, you don't have any ulterior motive. Well, I'm going to tell a lie about this. You tell what you saw. But you've only got 2 eyes, though. And that doesn't mean you can be looking in 2 places at once. You can only look in one place at one time, even though you have 2 eyes, unless you want to, split them and go sideways, and it won't work. So he's going to put, if he's a good policeman, put all the reports together and sum it all up, and then he'll find out where the rabbit was on the road, if there even was a rabbit. Maybe there was a 4th witness, and it was a child. And the rabbit started for the road, but it was his pet white rabbit, and he grabbed it before it got in the road. But everyone else thought that somehow it made it to the road, and the child knew better. Now, the same is true with the Gospels. You've got 4 different people that give the same event, but it's written from 4 different points of view. Chronicles, Samuel, Kings. Jeremiah says it one way when he writes Kings, but Ezra says it another way when he writes Chronicles. Neither one contradicting the other, but one adding to what he had written before him, or maybe after him, in the case of Ezra coming after Jeremiah, and therefore you put the whole thing together, you end up with a good account. All right, we come then to the sources for Chronicles. Unlike any other Old Testament book or any other biblical book, Chronicles provides us with a wealth of information concerning the source material that the author used. And I'll give you an example of some of these. Now, for a full list of these, you can go back to biblical literature, and we covered all the various missing books in the Old Testament. But here's just a sample. And no other Old Testament book outside of Chronicles gives us this much information. First of all, the words of Nathan the prophet. That was the source for some of the material in Chronicles. The words of Samuel the seer. The words of Gad the seer. The prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite. The visions of Iddo. The Midrash of Kings. Then the kings of Israel and Judah. Now that's not the same as our 1st and 2nd Kings, because it contains information that's not in 1st and 2nd Kings. The deeds of Uzziah, 1st and last, which were written, remember, by Isaiah. But remember, the only deeds of Uzziah that Isaiah had was his death, in Isaiah 1:1 and 6:1. But yet this says it's the deeds of Uzziah 1st and last. Couldn't have been our book of Isaiah then. The words of Jehu, and the words of Shemaiah the prophet. Now, that's not all of them, but that's just an example. of some of the sources that were used by the author of Chronicles. Getting back on our subject, I just thought of another familiar example of seeing things from a different point of view. Remember back in the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew says that Jesus gave it when he was on the Mount, and it was the Sermon on the Mount. But Luke says, no. Says, my information says that he was in the plain when he gave it. And Matthew says that he sat down. Luke says, no, he was standing when he said that. Matthew said he gave 9 beatitudes. Luke says, no, he gave 4, and after that he gave 4 woes. So you see, everything's entirely different. Who's right then? Matthew or Luke? Well, both of them are. You have to put them together. But most of the commentaries that you'll read will call one of them the Sermon on the Hill, and the other one the Sermon in the Plain. They think they're 2 entirely different sermons because one of them calls it the Sermon on the Mount, and the other one calls it the Sermon in the Plain. But the Greek word for plain there only means a level place. Well, every mountain has a level place on it somewhere. And why can't you be standing up when you begin your discussion and sitting down when you finish it? Or sitting down when you start it and standing up by the time you finish it? And one of them saying now when he started he was sitting, the other says, well, when he finished he was standing, or the reverse. Nothing contradicts anything that had been said before. It's just that everything has to be put together. Well, you'll really be surprised when we get to the Gospels. You'll just be amazed at what you took for granted there, and you'll find major contradictions on the surface between one evangelist, Matthew, and another evangelist, Luke, or especially between John and the 3 that wrote before him, because his is just entirely different than what the 3 had said before him. You got to remember, although you might have been taught something from one passage in the Gospels, don't favor that to the exclusion of the same account that's told somewhere else, or you'll end up with only half of the story. And then whenever you come across that passage later on in the Gospel, it will really throw you. Because you'll say, how can both of these things be true all at the same time? Take the example of the woman in John 12 who's anointing Jesus' feet. Now remember, that happens more than once in the Gospel. But is it the same account that happens in Luke 7 when the woman is anointing his feet? Remember, weeping over it and anointing him with costly oil? Is it the same account? Makes all the difference in the world in your chronology of the life of Christ between, is that account in John 12 the same one as that one back in Luke 7? And of course it occurs other places besides that. Concerning his resurrection appearances, to whom did he appear first? Was it the women? Was it Peter? Was it John? Was it the 11? Was it the 500 brethren, 1 Corinthians 15 talks about? Was it Mary, the mother of Joseph? Was it one of the other women? The steward of Herod, remember? She was one of the other women in Luke 8 that followed Jesus. Was she one of them? Was it Mary Magdalene? All of the Gospels seem to give a different account of who saw him first. What day was he crucified on? Wednesday? Thursday? Friday? John says a different day than Matthew, Mark, and Luke say. Did Jesus eat the Passover or did he not? And when was the Passover? All of them are different, you see. So the point is, just be careful. Don't build a doctrine on one passage if the same thing's covered somewhere else. Another problem that we have with Chronicles in comparison to Samuel and Kings is its extremely large numbers. There are around 20 cases in Chronicles where Chronicles is giving the same account that Samuel or Kings has given. And Samuel might say that, David slew 200 people, and Chronicles says that he slew 500 people. Most of the cases of a mix-up of numbers end up with the larger one being found in Chronicles. Between 18 and 20 examples, the larger number is found in Chronicles. Around 3 or 4 examples, the smaller number is found in Chronicles. Now let me give you an example. Look over in 1 Chronicles 11 and verse 11 with 2 Samuel 23 and verse 8. 2 Samuel 23, 8, 1 Chronicles 11, 11. What's our number here in 1 Chronicles 11:11? He lifted up his spear against 300 slain by him at one time. 2 Samuel 23:8. He lifted up his spear against 800 whom he slew at one time. Now this happens to be a case where it's smaller here, but nonetheless a difference between numbers. 1 Chronicles 21:12 with 2 Samuel 24:13. I believe this is one of the more well-known cases. 1 Chronicles 21:12. God gives King David 3 options. You can have either 3 years of famine, 3 months to be destroyed before your foes, or 3 days the sword of the Lord will be against you. 2 Samuel 24:13. You've got the 3 months before your enemies, the 3 days of the Lord's sword, or 7 years of famine. Chronicles, it was 3:3:3. And 2 Samuel, it's 7:3:3. Different number. 2 Chronicles 8:10 with 1 Kings 9:23. Second Chronicles 8:10. These were the chief of King Solomon's officers, even 250 that bear rule over the people. 250. 1 Kings 9:23. These were the chief of the officers that were over Solomon's work, 550, which bear rule over the people that wrought in the work. Well, how do we explain this? We explain it because of textual errors in transmission. Both numbers can't be right in all these cases. Only one number is right, and perhaps some later time we'll go through there and give you which is the right of the 2 numbers in all the cases, but both of them can't be right. But because of errors in transmission of the text and the erroneous figures, which are very easy to creep into the text because of the way that numbers are written in Hebrew. The critics have a field day with that, but it doesn't hurt inspiration of Scripture. It's just that through the process of the transmission of the text, then perhaps one Hebrew letter was confused for another, and you end up with 25 instead of 35. An outline for the book, 1 Chronicles. All right, now here you can go back and fill in where we are comparing what was found in Samuel and Kings. We'll continue it right on in Chronicles to know where to go to find out that incident or that person you're looking for. 1 Chronicles 1 through 9, we have the genealogies from Adam to David. Then chapters 10 through 29, history of David's kingship. All right, so you can find David's kingship in 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles 10 through 29. Only 2 places you can find it. So 1 to 9, genealogies from Adam to David. 10 to 29, history of David. 2 Chronicles, similar division. 1 to 9, history of King Solomon. All right, so you can find Solomon in 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11, or you can find him in 2 Chronicles chapters 1 to 9. Only place you're going to find King Solomon. So 1 through 9, a history of Solomon. 10 through 36, a history of the kings of Judah. All right, for the history of the kings of Judah, you can either find it in 2 Chronicles 10 through 36, or you can find it in 1 Kings 12 through the end of 2 Kings. Very easy, and it can only be found in one of those 2 places. Don't look in Samuel or in 1 Chronicles. So it's very easy when you remember this to remember which king is found in which place, especially the important ones like David and Solomon, because they're 2 of the early important ones, and they've got certain divisions, and of course David a lot more as far as material is concerned than Solomon, that belongs only to him. And you look in the right place, and lo and behold, you'll find what you're looking for. A memory text for 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 29:12. Both riches and honor come of thee, and thou reignest over all. And in thine hand is power and might, and in thine hand it is to make great and to give strength unto all. 2 Chronicles 16:9. You don't have to memorize the last part of the verse if you don't want to, because that has reference to Asa. But the first part is the blessing for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward him. And if you're a real pious saint, herein thou hast done foolishly, therefore from henceforth thou shalt have wars. But that might, scare you, so you might want to end with the period there in 16:9. Now, if you look on your outline, the last thing that I said we'd cover, well, I'll let you look and find out. Might be a big surprise to you. Conclusion. This is our conclusion. First of all, this is our conclusion to all of OT Intro. First of all, bear in mind that our study here in OT Intro is only an introduction to the Old Testament. You're not an authority, an Old Testament biblical scholar, authority on archaeology, chronology, genealogies, and all the ologies in the Old Testament, but you should be an authority on an introduction to the Old Testament. Secondly, although this is only an introduction, all that we've given you is an introduction, a knowledge of this material that you've been given in the last year and a half will put you far above 99% of most Christians in their knowledge of the Old Testament. So it's no small thing, although we're saying that you're not an Old Testament scholar just because you've had OT Intro. Nevertheless, that puts you far above. I mean far above. As far as the east is from the west, to use a figure of Scripture. Between what you know about the Old Testament and what the average nominal charismatic, if you will, church member, what he knows about the Old Testament. He knows nothing about the Old Testament. So if you've been listening in the last 65 weeks, then you'll know a lot about the Old Testament. Thirdly, I'd recommend that you organize your notes. Some of you, it's been a blessing to see, even go to the trouble of getting them all typed up, labeled and filed away. The more organized they are, the better, so that you can use them as reference material in the future. You come across some statement that you've read or that you've heard from someone, then you ought to have a whole catalog here of material. If it's about Ezra and who wrote Ezra and you can't remember, because you're not going to remember all that we've said in the last 60, 65 weeks, it's impossible to remember all that, but you ought to have a whole catalog, a whole file of all this material. And if you hear a statement made or you read it in some author's book and you want to check it out, if you've got everything organized, don't write things on envelopes and grocery bags and things like most people do. I remember seeing one woman in one service I was teaching. She had an envelope torn off the top of the envelope and had all her notes. Like you can really write anything on the envelope. I don't care if it's one of the big long envelopes, legal size, How are you going to get any Old Testament notes on that? And then read it, and then find it after you've got it down. Where are you going to file that? In a shoebox? That's where it goes. And then the shoebox goes in the trash can. So have an organized, systematized way, and you'll be able to use it as reference material. Fourthly, remember that the Old Testament is the area which the liberals attack first because of its age, because of its complexity, because of its length in material. So since the liberals attack it first, ahead of the New Testament, you want to be sure that you know something about it. And then finally, in conclusion, remember that our studies here in OT Intro are a foundation, not only for a deeper study of the Old Testament, but for everything that the New Testament has to say, because the new is founded upon the old. So this is a great foundation study that we've done. And it will prepare you greatly for all the future studies that we do in the Old Testament theology, as well as prepare you simply for Matthew 1:1, opening up the New Testament. Jesus Christ, the Son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, who's David and Abraham? Well, you know who they are now. And if you already knew them, then it goes on down there, son of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. Who's Shealtiel and Zerubbabel? Well, now you know who Zerubbabel is, and who Shealtiel is, and who Sheshbazzar is. And so it'll be a foundation, not only for Old Testament studies in the future, but for New Testament. All right. Hallelujah. We'll continually be making references back to some of the figures and dates when we get in other places, and I'll even tell you 722 or 605 or something, but I'm not going to sit there and explain all about what I mean by the date that I'm giving. I'll expect that you already know that, and all you need to do is just have a little refresher, a little reminder of what that date is, and you'll think 722 Samaria. Oh, I know what that is. That's the fall of Hoshea, who was last king in Israel, to the Assyrians. And that'll click in your mind. You might not remember all that, but if I just give you just one bit of information, then it should call something out of that computer of yours, and you'll be able to know what I'm talking about without pausing and taking 15 minutes to explain why Moses did write the whole Pentateuch. You see, we spent several whole messages in that. So we're not going to say now, Dan is mentioned back there in Genesis 14, so let's teach on Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Or he calls himself in Numbers 12:3, now the man Moses was meek above all the men that are on the face of the earth. Now, how can an author say that about himself? And how can Moses be writing as though it's another author? He's not writing in first person. Well, Caesar in his Gallic Wars wrote in third person. Xenophon wrote in third person. We gave you some examples of great works in history where the authors wrote third person rather than first person, even though they were talking about themselves.
For a complete